There she sits on the eastern slope of Cleopatra Hill in the Black Mountains of central Arizona, perched like an eagle a mile high. Jerome, clinging precariously to an antsy Mother Earth. You know, at one time she was covered with oak and pine, but for 60 years she was stripped of all vegetation by the acid fumes of the copper smelter and the lumber used in the mines, once the lifeblood of this town. I know. I remember. I lived here from '02 to '22, till I died of consumption at the ripe, if not old, age of 36. Feel strange talking to a ghost? Well, you ought to try being one. It's even stranger. But who better to take you through a town's history than someone who was there while it all happened? Part of it, leastways. I stuck around. I got to like the place. I remember how it used to look. Might different from how it looks now. $1 billion copper camp to the biggest ghost town in America. It's a pretty long haul. Been through a lot, this place. Almost like trying to cover the history of a country in the time it takes to chew and spit a good wad of tobacco. But I'll give it a try. Can't fault me for trying. Name's Sam Durham. And in case you hadn't noticed, this is the graveyard. Best view I ever had of that town. Too bad I had to kick in order to get it. How about some background? I'll tell. You watch.
Now, in the 1500s, Antonio de Espejo and Marcos Farfan both claimed mineral deposits on the eastern slopes in the name of the Spanish crown. But it wasn't until 1865 when the white man arrived in the Verde Valley from Prescott, despite warnings of aggressive Apaches, mind you, that a cavalry post was established at Fort Verde under the command of General Crook and General Miles. By 1876, prospectors had located 10 claims and a mill site, and the rest, as they say, is history. But time, with the help or hindrance of people and progress, has a way of eroding history. It is to the credit of Jerome's most vocal and foresighted citizens that over the years so much of her history has managed to survive, if not always well preserved. This is Town Hall today. Was yesterday, too. The first town hall was built at the turn of the century. Then the new building went up the year of the crash, and it was the headquarters for the clerk, the police, the mayor, and 5-member council, and held all the town records. In '29, Jerome's population was 15,000. These were the boom days when Jerome was the 3rd largest city in Arizona. By the turn of the century, we were incorporated and already the 4th largest incorporated town in the territory. You know, this town is older even than the state of Arizona, the 48th state in the Union. Frederick A. Tritle, before he was governor of the territory, assisted in the organization of the United Verde Copper Company, and the camp was named Jerome in honor of Eugene M. Jerome of New York, secretary and treasurer of the enterprise. The next year, '83, I think, the company became a New York corporation with James A. McDonald, an insurance executive, as president, Tritle as vice president, and Jerome, who was a prominent New York attorney and cousin of Jenny Jerome, Sir Winston Churchill's mother. How do you like that? Well, he was designated secretary. The company was capitalized for $3 million, and the issuance of 300,000 shares at a par value of $10 each was authorized. 75 men, mostly Irish, were employed at the mine and smelter at wages of between $3 and $4 a day. That same year, the post office was established. Then a year later, a financial panic hit New York, depressing the metal market, and by fall, copper prices suffered a drastic decline. In October, the smelter and mines were closed following a strike by the workmen because payment of their wages was delayed. Can you blame them? Well, if it hadn't been the strike, would have been something else. Heck, we had 60 miles of road to haul this stuff from the mines, and all of it by mule. Nevertheless, the town busied itself building their first schoolhouse. The Clark Street Elementary School building replaced the old schoolhouse in the mid-1920s, just after I was replaced, you might say. It was used until the early 50s, and still here, as you can see, though empty. But the prize for Jerome's oldest building goes to the warehouse. Look at her. Ain't she a beaut? Almost 100 years old. It's now used by the town's artists and craftsmen. It survived 3 devastating fires in the decade it was built. A good record by any standard. Here's what's left of the boardwalk. Only 6 houses remain. One of them in ruins. But wasn't she something in her prime? You know, fires were a heap of trouble in those days. Fact, one reason we got ourselves incorporated was to get a water system to fight them. City ordinances, too. Brick don't burn like wood now, does it? Figure this. The fire of 1898 alone cost Jerome 24 saloons and 14 Chinese restaurants. 24 saloons. What a waste. But there was a lot more going on in town than just fires before the turn of the century. When William A. Clark of Montana optioned a large majority of stock in the copper company, he helped set off Jerome's first big boom. 2 years later, the Jerome Public Library was founded. And 2 years after that, the branch railroad from Prescott to Ash Fork was completed. Hallelujah! Had enough of those mules. Clark connected Jerome to this new road by a narrow-gauge railroad from Chino Valley. With this event, the town was now ready to go into the 20th century with both barrels loaded. I guess they saw me coming. A new smelter went into production with a capacity of between 3.5 and 5 million pounds of copper a month. And a year later, the United Verde Copper Company was making a profit of $1 million a month. Imagine that. $1 million a month. It was at this time that Jerome's first newspaper was established by Herbert E. Wilcox. The Jerome Chronicle was, in fact, only the first of many papers, succeeded by the Jerome Mining News, the Jerome Reporter, Jerome Copper Belt, Jerome Sun, and the Verde Copper News. Still, some of the biggest news were the fires. The one of 1894 began underground in one of the upper levels of the United Verde mine. The fire eaters, they were specially trained Spaniards from the Rio Tinto tin mines in Spain, were brought in, but to no avail. Then we had a fire on Christmas Eve. Lit up a heck of a lot more than a few Christmas trees, let me tell you. Then another one in '99. The 20th century rode in at a full gallop and a sizzle, too. But not before George W. Hull organized the United Verde Extension Gold, Silver, and Copper Mining Company. Now Jerome was at its height, with a company-owned hospital, theaters, restaurants, an opera house. It was the shopping center for the entire Verde Valley. The bill of fare at the opera house. That was on the 3rd floor of the Masonic Building. There it is. In October of 1900 read Finnegan's Ball, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the then popular temperance play 10 Nights in a Bar Room. A lot of good that did. We had plenty of bar rooms. Of course, if you were a woman in 1905, you were out of luck. For that was the year that the council under Mayor Hull decided to bar women from saloons. But saloons and hotels were many and prosperous well into the new century. The Mine Museum here was originally constructed as the fashion saloon, though during Prohibition it was turned into a drugstore. And in '06, the foes of gambling lost out to the gamblers. Well, at least for a while. This was the Bartlett Hotel, believe it or not. Now it's the site of ruins and a coin toss. But at one time it housed liquor stores, the Bank of Jerome, a newspaper, restaurant, and a mortuary. I was there for a spell. And the Montana Hotel, oh, she was a sight, though she's long gone, was at one time Arizona's largest and most luxurious hotel with 200 rooms, a huge dining room, spacious lobby, and breathtaking chandeliers. She was destroyed by fire. And how about the Connor Hotel? Time's taken a toll. But she remains after being gutted by fire twice and rebuilt again out of brick. It was also the home of the Connor Cafe and became a sort of early tourist spot when the Cuban Queen, one of Jerome's most noted madams, chose the cafe as the place to take her girls out for dinner every Sunday. More about them in a minute. Look at that. An editorial from the early days of the Jerome Reporter stated, "There is practically no crime in Jerome. Deeds of violence are almost unknown." Well, if that was not altogether accurate, it was true that the town's seedier side was fairly well hidden from the rest of the world. Townsfolk knew better, though. One woman practically everyone knew was Jerome's most famous madam, Jenny Banters. In our heyday, Jerome was home to as many as 120 women folk in the red light district and bordellos, and Jenny was the main madam. She owned her own 2-story building, and some people said she was the richest woman in northern Arizona. When her building was destroyed in each of the 3 big fires, she managed to rebuild it almost as quickly as it was destroyed. Insurance and jewels paid for that, though I suspect some of us would have helped too if needed. She was the first property owner in the business district to build a sidewalk in front of her building. Though one can only wonder why. I don't. Jenny also managed to survive a scandal when one of her girls was murdered, after which the killer committed suicide. Years later, story goes, Jenny herself was shot down in the street by an ex-boyfriend, an opium addict, in Gold Road, Arizona. In '05, the council, in addition to barring women from saloons, told the prostitutes to pack up and leave town. But the following year, that was the year of the Great Quake in Frisco. Well, after a new council was elected here, the women were permitted to stay, so long as they reported for a physical examination twice a month. Having closed many years ago, all that remains now of the cribs, and that was the home and workplace of the ladies of the night, it's an empty lot. A sorry tribute, I'd say. Even so, Jerome continued to prosper, and in '08, Arizona became the largest copper-producing state in the country, producing 274 million pounds. Then we had the discovery of the United Verde extension, known as the UVX, or the Little Daisy, headed by James S. Douglas, son of the man who was outbid by Clark for the United Verde. Its discovery was another big boom for Jerome, and after producing more than $100 million in copper, gold, and silver, it was mined out in '38. The UVX built the Little Daisy Hotel as a boarding house for its miners. It was closed along with the mine. The mining companies also built hospitals for their employees. Hampton House, heck, now it's just a parking lot, was built as Jerome's second hospital. It was later remodeled into a boarding house for United Verde miners after the third and largest hospital, the clubhouse, was built. Though Hampton House was demolished in the 40s, the clubhouse still stands, having sustained damage when the Verde Fault decided to move. It's now a private residence. Well, semi-private. I hang out there time to time. Finally, the United Verde Hospital, long as we're talking about them, was built by the United Verde Copper Company and provided 52 beds. It was closed by Phelps Dodge Mining Corporation in the 50s, and in the 70s, apartments were furnished on some of the floors. The United Verde also built the United Verde Apartment Building as housing for its employees. And the Surgeon's Mansion, which the company built in 17 for the head surgeon of the hospital, is now also a private residence. The same year the mansion went up, Jerome had its first Boy Scout troop. But it was also the year that an entire block was destroyed by yet another fire. And then another fire a month later, which demolished 9 homes in the Mexican Quarter. Before that decade was out, the miners' union called a strike for higher wages, which they won. And then the Spanish influenza claimed 100 lives. But the 20s brought problems of their own, and most of them without my help. Heavy blasting caused rock falls and slides, and millions of rocks fell from the hills. Nevertheless, by 29, Jerome's population had reached 15,000. What we now know was its peak. The year after I departed, the Jerome High School buildings were first completed and then added to over the years until its school days ended in 72. In 35, Phelps Dodge Corporation bought the United Verde Holdings for $20,800,000 and made it all back, plus millions more. By the time the United Verde mine had been worked out, it had produced 2.5 billion pounds of copper, 50 million ounces of silver, 1 million pounds of gold, and millions of pounds of zinc. By 1955, the population of Jerome was less than 100. Them was lonely times for me. But no history of Jerome, however brief, would be complete without the mention of her churches. If the town had its hands full with miners and madams, it also had a lively church life as well. But heck, who am I to talk? First time I set foot in a church up here, I was flat on my back in a box. The first Protestant church, don't look for it, it ain't around anymore, was Jerome's first house of worship. Constructed by Baptists in 1896, it was later sold to the Congregationalists and then sold to the Episcopalians. Now, I don't mean to imply any mishandling by the Episcopalians, but things started to go downhill from there. In fact, after the building itself literally slid downhill, it had to be dismantled. The Holy Family Catholic Church was rebuilt out of brick in 1898 after the original wood building was destroyed by fire. Also fortunate in that regard is the Mexican Methodist Church, also known as the Powder Box Church. It was built out of scrap wood, metal and stucco, and largely comprised of discarded dynamite boxes. Completed in 1940, it's now a vacation home for its owner and me. But don't tell him that. The First Protestant Church, though, is not alone when it comes to sliding. Witness the sliding jail, now a landmark after sliding 225 feet from its original position. I can honestly say I spent no time there. At least none I can remember. Well, enough about buildings and such. What happened to the people? After all, that's what makes a town, ain't it? Well, World War II generated some mining activity here, which, as you know, had been on the lam for a while. But after the war, people left. Buildings came down, and that was pretty much the case well into the 50s. Those were tough times for folks up here. Fact is, wasn't unusual for someone to trade in their house to pay off a grocery bill. I'd call that tough, wouldn't you? But life went on anyway. In '53, we had our first annual spook night, right around Halloween time usually, in honor of ghosts, both living and dead. Same year, the Jerome Historical Society was established, which helped to slow down the destruction of buildings. Good thing, too. Them buildings is what gives this town character. Well, you might have seen trouble coming if you were here in January of '57, because that was the year Elvis Presley paid us a visit. I think we might have made him famous, too. Then 2 years after that, '59, I think, we had our first annual Ghost City Hill climb. Went on for 5 years, till the climb got bigger than the hill, I think. There it is, you can see for yourself. Brought in about 2,000 to 7,000 people just for the day. Talk about a population explosion. Well, heck, we survived. So did the bats. Yep, you heard right. Years before, the bats in town had all been killed off, and we were sorry about it too. They were killing off the flying pests, mosquitoes and gnats and such. But in '62, the bats came back. That was the year the United States government advised families to build fallout shelters, just in case, you know. Well, we didn't take much to that up here. Didn't take to it years later when the bikers and the longhairs moved into town neither. They were called hippies, but it didn't matter to a lot of folks what they were called. They just weren't welcome. Nope. Didn't have no parades nor welcome wagons for them neither. Funny though, 20 years later, a few of them are still here, and a right solid addition to our family too. Well, time just plodded on. Tourism steadily improved, but the '70s saw more dogs up here than kids. Lots of potlucks, transients, and we even had ourselves an ashram for a while. In 1979, our population was around 400. You couldn't fill most theaters with that, could you? But if you look closely, you can see where the groundwork was laid that has made Jerome the prospering little town it is today. In '53, the year of the first spook night, the Verde Valley Artists Association was begun. Take a good look at the views up here and you have a pretty good idea why this place is such an attraction to artists. Why, it's inspiring. When the Sons of Douglas in 1962 gave their family mansion, built by their daddy, Rawhide Jimmy Douglas, to the state parks, they were 5 years ahead of everyone else in declaring the historical importance of the town. In '67, Jerome finally became a national historic landmark. The once billion-dollar copper camp may seem by some to have progressed beyond the largest ghost city in America. In 1988, the population was 500, up more than 400 since '55. Well, whatever you call it, Jerome remains a vital slice of American history, alive and well, preserved and persistent as it moves into the 21st century.
As for me, I'll stick around a while longer. Just curious to see how it all turns out. Keep your eyes open. You may spot me if you're quick. And if not, well, how many folks you know can say they toured a real ghost town with a real, genuine ghost?